One of the great challenges of reading the Bible is our tendency to simplify these stories into nice and clean bedtime tales. The story of Noah is a perfect example of that. A boat full of animals and rainbows and doves, you can start to think that it's a kid's story. My kids even have a floating Noah's Ark toy that they play with in the bathtub. I'm thankful my kids are learning these stories, but the story of Noah's Ark is hardly a child's fairy tale. In fact, this story captures one of the most difficult and complex tensions of the Bible. There are few days more dark and painful than those in which God's judgment on sin is finally forced upon humanity. Those first drops of rain were a realization that our lives do not escape His awareness. God is not willing to lose His creation. What does God do when all but one lone family on earth has rebelled against Him? What does a creator do when His creation has become a curse to itself? How dark is the day when the earth can best be described by its chaotic violence? By chapter 6 of Genesis, the seed of rebellion planted in Adam and Eve's single act of disobedience had grown into a world of horrific violence and brutality. Cain's murder of his brother Abel was just the start. The whole earth had become a place of rebellion. Genesis presents creation as a place filled with God's presence, but we're now told corruption fills the earth. We too often miss the tension of this story, but Genesis sets the full weight of it on us. What should God do? With His creation in full rebellion against Him, and each new generation deepening the suffering and injustice upon the next, what is God to do? Can we really expect Him to do nothing? Does God wipe His hands clean and walk away from it, leaving us to suffer under the brokenness we inherit and then go on to ourselves perpetrate? Is this the story? The world spiraling into worse corruption and violence? Or does God step in? Does He bring justice? If you have ever had to confront the injustice of a friend or a child who you deeply love, you know how difficult this tension can be. And you know that walking away is never the loving thing to do. Instead, we enter into the full complexity of it. And so too, God makes the gut-wrenching decision to draw a line. This violence can go no further. For the good of humanity and creation, and out of His love for them, God chooses to directly involve Himself and stop it. This is one of the great tensions of the Bible. How can God be both just and loving? How can He rescue His creation when it's His creation that has rebelled? Maybe the surprising part of this story is not that God would put an end to humanity's violence, but that He was not willing to put an end to humanity. God's commitment to His creation is far greater than we would have expected. Great enough that Noah himself is saved, and Noah's family would take up the original calling, God's purpose of filling the earth and walking with Him. I think the beginning of Genesis suggests something that we each deeply know is true. This world is not as it should be. We are not who we were created to be. And if we are honest with ourselves, we both suffer and contribute to this world's brokenness. This same sin which invaded the garden and rallied the world into rebellion, this sin is within us. The world needs to be rescued. We need to be rescued. And what we discover in Genesis is a God not willing to abandon us, even when we have abandoned Him. Genesis tells the story of a God who promises to redeem his creation. It shows us a God who is deeply a part of this story. We are called to listen, to see that from the beginning, this is God's story. It's the story of how God is rescuing his people. It's the story of how one righteous person can become the hope of a new humanity. Listen.
Over the last few weeks, we started this journey of learning the Word of God, to really get back into the Bible and start with the very beginning of what the Bible is. It's something that a lot of us have grown up listening to. It's something that we've connected with. But I feel that there are times that some of us don't know these stories. And it's really great to go back into this. We're discovering in this book God's epic story of redemption, of love, of forgiveness. As we go from Genesis to Revelation, and today's message brings us to Genesis chapter 6, and God's plan for creation isn't exactly where it would go. This is not a good day. This is a really awful time happening where most of humanity have rebelled, have walked away. You know, parents in the room, it's Father's Day, but I'm going to talk to parents in general. Have you ever just had enough of your kids? I remember my mother at times just going, I've had just enough. When we weren't listening, we weren't cleaning. There's been times where Joy, especially after teaching all day and dealing with Judah, she's just told me, I've had enough. I need to have 15 minutes, half an hour where I can just get away and reset. There's a comedian, Mark Lowry, told his mother when she said, I've had enough, in response, he said, well, help yourself, Mama. There's plenty more where that's come from. Today, we come to the point where God has had enough. And it's a kind of a terrifying story. It really is. If it wasn't for the promise at the end of the story of the rainbow, that he would never flood again, this destruction that comes upon the earth where he kills everybody. How many of you remember pushing your parents a little too far? Or maybe parents, your kids, pushing you a little too far. And then there's no turning back. Consequences, they are coming down the path. You know that punishment is coming of some way, shape, or form, and you can beg, you can plead, but it doesn't change the outcome. At times kids need to be punished, and because they need to know what boundaries are and how far where is too far, and they actually find that they are more comfortable and able to work within these boundaries better when they know where the boundaries are. But at the same time, when it comes down to it, I hate when I have to spank my kids. It just breaks my heart. I don't want to do that to them, but I don't go chasing them down. I don't do it in anger. I said, all right, come here. And just watching them take that step by step, knowing that what's going to come. They've pushed it too far. They've crossed the boundary, and consequences are coming. And I spank them, and then we talk about it. We give a hug, and I show that this is still love. The old King James says, if you spare the rod, you spoil your child. But if you look at the ESV, which is a more literal translation, it says, spare the rod, hate your child. I remember reading that for the first time when I was in North Pole, and I was talking with the kids in kids' church and going, you know what that means? If you do spare the rod, parents, you don't love your kids. And I said to the kids, so if that means if your parents aren't spanking you or they're not disciplining you, they don't love you. In other words, spanking is a form of love. And they went, what? It's a form of love? But it is. Because if you don't, it's not just that you don't discipline them now. If you don't teach them appropriate boundaries and respect now, they're going to push it later on in life. My family likes watching The Big Bang Theory. It's not about The Big Bang Theory, but Sheldon. This past week we were watching an episode, and he was called to traffic court. He's in trouble, and Sheldon's one that pushes the boundaries, partly because of probably disabilities he has, and he pushed the boundaries with the judge. That landed him in jail until he apologized to the judge. And so Penny calls up Leonard and goes, what happened? And she goes, well, he did the same type of stuff he does with all the rest of us, but he did it to a judge, and the judge isn't putting up with it. If we don't teach our kids their boundaries and how to show respect now, it happens to have consequences down the road that has lifelong issues. I mean, it's amazing to me. People look for shortcuts. They look for ways to get out of that, and yet, in what may seem like a shortcut of robbing a place to get the money, can end up costing way more in the long run than what it would have been to actually earn the money the legal way with a job. Because you might go, I can go rob a place and I can earn $1,000 real fast by clearing out the cash register. Well, $1,000, that's a felony right there. That's something that's going to chase you the rest of your life. And that $1,000 thing is going to cost at least a year of your life, if not more. And yet, you can earn $1,000 within a few weeks at most jobs now. So it has lifelong things. There's consequences. You see, God is righteous, and sin must be judged. Psalm 89:14 says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. The very building blocks of who God is, the foundation of his throne is on righteousness and justice. And so when we come to God, we have to know that's part of his character. Holiness is in his nature. That's why our culture so desperately wants to avoid judgment. And so they cry out to us, don't judge me, don't put me in a box, don't do this to me, because they know that if there is judgment, then there must be justice. There must be consequences for sin. And there really is, and there's consequences that we see. There's natural consequences. And I feel like these are things that God wrote into nature that to help teach us. I mean, the natural consequences of sleeping around are STDs. Natural consequences. STDs are rampant today because people say, don't judge me. But yet there are these consequences that are already there. And so God's not trying to keep you from having fun, but he created that fun on purpose in a safe marriage. Because in the marriage, with two monogamous couples, there isn't STDs, because it's done in the way that God designed. And here's the thing, and STDs are just a really easy way to show natural consequences. Without the atonement of Jesus, we all fall short. We all are guilty of some sort of that. And our consequences of our sin that Adam and Eve learned from the very beginning is death. We are all on a path to death. From the second we take our first breath, our body starts to decay to the point where at one point our body stops working, and it is going to die. And so the consequence of the original sin was that death was going to come to man. And we learn as we get a little bit further into Genesis that there's a long time where people were living. We're over 900 years. That's a long life till God finally caps it at 120. But still, death comes to us all. And the only way that we avoid eternal death is by finding the atonement of Jesus and what he has for us. But here's the thing, if we focus only on God's judgment, because that's what this story is about today. We're doing the story of Noah's Ark, if you couldn't tell from my ark in the picture there. And that's about God's judgment. But if we only focus on his judgment, and there's the old turn of the century sermon saying sinners in the hands of an angry God. If that's all that we look at is this judgment and this anger of God against sin, then we miss God's passion and love for his creation. And how much he wants to redeem his creation. Romans 3:23 through 25 says that for everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. Yet God, in his grace, freely makes us right in his sight. He did this through Christ Jesus when he freed us from the penalty of our sin. For God presented Jesus as the sacrifice for sin. People are made right with God when they believe that Jesus sacrificed his life, shedding his blood. And this sacrifice shows that God was being fair. Here's the justice again. When he held back and did not punish those who sinned in times past. That's why later, as we continue the story, we'll see Jesus make an appearance to atone, to make right, to pay the price for the sin once and for all. But we're not there right now. And right now, man is at the point where they are facing judgment. And it's a scary place to be. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Genesis chapter 5. Verse 14. As we continue our story. Chapter 6, verse 5. We're going to read through 14. That's where the 14 comes in. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was constantly and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry he had ever made them on the earth, and it broke his heart. And the Lord said, I will wipe this human race I have created from the face of the earth. Yes, I will destroy everything, every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals, and the scurrying along the ground, even the birds of the sky. I am sorry I ever made them. But Noah found favor with the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, the only blameless person on the earth at that time, and he walked in close fellowship with God. Noah was the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Noah saw that, God saw that the earth had become corrupted and was filled with violence, and God observed all this corruption in the world, for everyone on earth was corrupt. So God said to Noah, I have decided to destroy all living creatures, for they have filled the earth with violence. Yes, I will wipe them all out along the earth. Build a large boat from cypress wood and waterproof it with tar inside and out. And so God starts to lay out before Noah a plan for salvation. You know, I've tried to imagine what it must have been like to be Noah. How would you respond if God told you something like that? The whole earth is corrupt. I want you to build an ark. I want you to build a boat. You're going to save the world with this. I'm not sure about you, but I probably would have asked God, did I hear you right? You're going to flood the earth. And bear in mind, it has never rained before. You're going to make rain fall from this. You're going to make water fall from the sky. Flood the earth, and I'm gonna get on this boat I'm building in the middle of a desert, and it's going to float, and all the animals are gonna somehow come to my boat, get on this thing, and we're gonna survive this storm. Are you sure, God? You know, it's kind of funny because you see Gideon, where Gideon tests God and go, okay, God, I'm going to put this fleece in the ground. If you guys know that story, and in the morning, the fleece is dry and all the ground is wet with dew, and he reverses it. There's no question from Noah. I'm not sure if there was a conversation. I know if it was me, I'd be asking God, are you sure? Did I hear you right? But Noah, it said earlier on, he walked this is verse 9, he walked in close fellowship with God. He knew God. He had communion with him. He spent time with him. And so because he walked in close fellowship, when he heard the voice of God, he didn't question whether or not it was God. He knew it was, so he starts to prepare. He starts to build the ark. And even though everyone around him calls him crazy, I mean, I can just imagine there was probably some entrepreneur in the area that said, "Come on out! See the crazy man building a boat in the middle of the desert. He says there's water going to fall from the sky and we're all going to die. Come on out and see the crazy man." Probably charging money to go see Noah, right? In the middle of the desert, doing whole tours and everything. And yet Noah stayed faithful. He continued to trust in God. Through no fault of his own, his entire life, in that one moment when God talked to him, was upended. We don't know anything about Noah before this except that he was a righteous man who walked with God. He was counted as blameless because he walked in close communion with God. But yet the efforts and consequences of sin from everybody else were all around him. I mean, if you've ever had a moment to say to God, "It's not fair," you need to look at Noah's life. Because if anyone had a right to say, "God, it's not fair," was this guy who was living righteously, who was going to have his whole life pulled away from him. And the only people that were going to survive was Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. Think about that. Anybody that he had friends with, that he grew up with, even though they were evil, I mean, we all know people that aren't the most righteous people, and yet they're our friends. They were going to die. He was going to lose everything. Any earthly possession that he had was gone. Any house that he built was gone. Through no fault of his own, he was losing it all. His whole life was ripped away. And yet he was faithful and trusted in God and started to build the ark. It's really remarkable when you think about it because everything was going on. And so the thing is, we often cry out, "God, it's not fair." We've been there. If we're really honest, every one of us has said it before. "God, it's not fair. Why is this happening to me right now?" In fact, not only do we cry out, our kids cry out to us. "It's not fair." Oh my goodness, I hear that so much from my kids sometimes. It's not fair. And as adults, what do we say? Life's not fair, right? We just, we throw out that coin thing because we heard our parents say it to us and probably their parents said it to them. Because it's something that in the inmost part of our being, we want justice, we want the scales to be balanced, we want life to be fair, but here's the thing, thank God it's not fair. Because if it was fair and we got what we deserved, we would all be dead. Because the penalty of our sin is death. And so thank God it's not fair. Because even though Noah was a righteous man, he still sinned and he still deserved death, but God saw in Noah the righteousness of him because he did yearn after God and spent time in communion with God. And he went after what God has for him. Matthew 5:45 part B says, "For he gives his sunlight," God gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. We live in a broken and fallen world that isn't yet restored. It says in, I believe it's Romans 8, that all of creation is yearning for the time when God will come back and call his own back home, that we can once again be with him. And yet we're in this time of in-between where Jesus died on the cross, but he has not yet restored creation, and creation is living in a time period that it is not right. I mean, while I just look at what's happening with climate at times and look at the way that mankind is destroying the world. I love living in Alaska because we live in so much untouched creation where we can go driving and just look at the amazingness of what God has done. And yet we're driving on a scar on the earth called a road that man has gone through and carved out. And yes, we were called by God to go through and tame the ground and make it our own. That is part of the commands. But we are still destroying God's creation. There's no question about it. And it's a time, and part of that's because we're living in a fallen world. It's not yet restored to perfection. And we serve a righteous God who yearns for righteousness for his followers. We know that Noah sinned in his life. So what does it mean to be righteous? Well, I'm glad you asked, Pat. According to Webster's dictionary, the word righteous means acting in accord with divine or moral law, free of guilt or sin. We know that way back, the tree of knowledge of good and evil meant that there was some sort of morality put inside of people where we have this inherent instinct to know right and wrong. Prior to the written Torah that we get to in Exodus, they have found the oldest written law was the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, and it was a law saying that murdering is bad, and it's a remarkably amazing law considering this was a secular law, but the morality was still there, and it was one of the earliest attempts to write down righteousness and what that means. So righteousness either has to come from the divine or some sort of moral law. Righteousness means free from guilt or sin. In Genesis 6:9, it says that Noah was a righteous man, the only blameless person living on earth. So he was righteous, free from blame or guilt. Now we know that he had sin, so he was free from the guilt of sin because of his communion that he had with God. His fellowship. And so as a result, Noah was in a great position for God to use him. And so the only way that Noah was blameless was because of his communion with God. There is a saying that you become like the 5 people you spend the most time with. And you know, it's so important when you look at the influence. We talked about this a few weeks ago. Look at the influence of people in your life. And you can see who has had a big influence upon your life. When I look at my own life, I look at Pastor Billy, and I've learned a lot of how I preach and how I move and how I do ministry from Pastor Billy because I worked underneath him for 10 years, and he had a big influence on my life. I look at, I'm the type of counselor I am because of J.T. Bolin, who was a counselor that I've worked under. While I don't talk like him and I don't believe the same stuff that we have, some of the same compassion that he has, I've made a part of my own person because I spent a lot of time with him, and he has helped teach me and grow me as a counselor. And when you look at your own lives, I'm sure you can look at different periods of your life where your friends around you maybe weren't so righteous, they maybe weren't righteous at all, and so you went down that same path with them. In American Society of Addiction Medicine, which is the go-to treatment manual for all addiction medicine across the United States, and it is how we determine the level of care someone needs. The last criteria is the type of living environment that a person has, and is that environment supportive for recovery? And when we look at a person's environment, if we see that they live by themselves and they only have non-sober friends, we say no, their home environment is not supportive. And that one factor, there's 6 areas, that one factor can change a person from being able to do outpatient to residential. Because if you don't have a place in your home environment where you can be safe, we want to put you in a place that you're going to be safe. Because we want to surround you by other people that want the same thing that you do. And we're hoping that by the time you get out of that residential treatment, your patterns have changed and you don't want to hang around those same friends. But those that go to residential, and then they come back to the same environment and they never change their friends, go back to addiction every time. They have to change the people they hang around with. Noah was righteous because he chose to surround himself with God instead of the men of the earth, because we know that everybody else was wicked. His sons were wicked, but they were saved because of their father. In Genesis 18, we see that God is righteous in dealing with the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Deuteronomy, we see that God is righteous in revealing his word to the nation of Israel. In Nehemiah 9, he is righteous by following through on his promises. In Isaiah 30:18, we see that God is righteous when he shows love and compassion. And throughout the Bible, we see over and over and over again that God is righteous. And there is Noah walking with God, walking with the one who is righteous. And God chose to use him to do his work. The great thing about this story is that you can also pursue righteousness by walking with God. That's a big reason why we're doing this push as we start in the Bible Engagement Project, because the more you engage with the Bible, the more you then spend time praying and contemplating, the more you start to walk with God on a daily basis. If you haven't yet pulled out the personal devotions, you'll see where it asks you some obvious questions like, what is the Bible saying here? But then there's other times where it's asking you to reflect, to pray about what God is doing there. This is baby steps to start walking with God. And where you can really start to enter in and go, what is really God saying? How is God moving here? What is God doing in my life? And then in that little group, there's a group area, which if you haven't joined yet, I can give you the code for that, or I can text it to you, and then you can go through with this community of believers and walk together with God, because we want to surround ourselves with others that are going the same way. But Noah surrounded himself with the fellowship of the Creator. Mark Batterson says, I live for the applause of nail-scarred hands. And just going after, it's so easy to live for the applause of others. I was recognized this year at TCC for making a difference with my job. Awesome. And it feels good to have the applause of your coworkers and your employer. But ultimately, I live for the applause of nail-scarred hands, of hearing my Father, of hearing Jesus say, well done, my good and faithful servant. And how do I know I'm going to get that one day? Is by walking in fellowship with him, spending time in his word, learning what it means to serve a righteous God, learning what it means to become more righteous myself, and taking that time every day to die to self and follow him. Romans 12:1 says, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. We're not sacrificing like the prophets of Baal did on Mount Carmel, cutting ourselves up and making blood flow. I'm really thankful that was not God's definition of a living sacrifice. Our living sacrifice is dying to self, saying, I'm not going to live the sinful way like every other person is born to. I'm not going to follow my flesh and satisfy my flesh, but instead, I'm going to follow you and what you have for me, because I'm living for the applause of nail-scarred hands. That's living sacrifice. And so how do we do that? Well, Paul continues, do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world. Don't follow what everybody else is doing, but be transformed. How? With the renewing of your mind, so you may test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. We have to go after what God has for us, and we do that by changing our thought patterns. The world says, if it feels good, do it. God says, follow me, and I'll give you pleasures forevermore. And so God gives Noah specific instructions on how to build the ark. Very specific instructions. And over the next 120 years, that's a long project, guys. 120 years. Noah stayed faithful to the instructions God had given him. I don't know about you, but I've got projects sometimes I'll start, and they get put on the back shelf. Any other guys like that in here? That you have this good intentions. Wives, don't jab your husbands too hard in the chest. You have good intentions. You start something, then you put it on the back shelf. Well, Noah worked on this faithfully for 120 years. There's no reference to God ever repeating his command to Noah. God gave him the command. He gave him the blueprints and said, all right, Noah, go ahead and build. He had no frame of reference for what was about to happen and no similar experience, so he only had one course of action if he and his family were going to survive, because the storm was coming. So what does he do? Let's continue reading. Genesis 6, starting in verse 17. Look, I'm about to cover the earth with a flood that will destroy every living thing that breathes. Everything on earth will die. But I will confirm my covenant with you. So enter the boat, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring a pair of every kind of animal, a male and a female, into the boat with you to keep them alive during the flood. Pairs of every kind of bird and every kind of animal and every kind of small animal that scurries along the ground will come to be kept alive. And be sure to take on board enough food for your family and all the animals. So Noah did everything exactly as God commanded him. Noah was sheltered from the storm because he chose to trust and obey. I'm going to say this one more time. You guys got to hear this morning. Noah was sheltered from the storm because he chose to trust and obey. There's an old song that we used to sing, trust and obey, for there's no other way. What's the next part? To be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey. This entire journey of life is all about trusting and obeying our Creator. In fact, throughout this listening journey, this listen that we're doing right now, we'll see this theme repeated time and time and time again, to trust and obey God. So for 120 years, Noah trusted and obeyed. Chapter 7. So when everything was ready, the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the boat with all your family, for among the people of the earth I can see that you alone are righteous. Take with you 7 pairs, male and female, of each animal I have approved for eating and for sacrifice, and take 1 pair of each of the others. Also take 7 pairs of every kind of bird. There must be a male and female in each pair to ensure that all life will survive on the earth after the flood. 7 days from now I will make the rains pour down on the earth, and it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights until I have wiped from the earth all the living things that I have created." So Noah did everything as the Lord commanded him. Noah trusted and obeyed. You see those exact same words again? Noah did everything the Lord had commanded him. It was total obedience to follow God. I want to take a look at total obedience, because oftentimes we don't like total obedience. We like to kind of skirt the outside sometimes and kind of push the boundaries ourselves. If you're speeding but you don't come to if you aren't speeding but you don't come to a complete stop at a stop sign, maybe you do what's called the California stop, right? The little rolling stop. You're probably still going to get a ticket. Your defense might be, "But officer, I wasn't speeding." Partial obedience, right? It was enough, right, officer? Samuel confronted Saul on his partial obedience. Saul didn't wait for Samuel to come and perform the sacrifices. Saul did not kill all of the animals and the king of the land that he was called to conquer. Saul did most of it, but he kept the choice ones for himself. And it was his partial obedience that cost Saul the kingdom, and meant that it was not through the line of Saul that Jesus came, but through his predecessor, the line of David, that we have Jesus. Because Saul didn't do total obedience, he only did partial, and didn't follow what God called for him. The result of total obedience is being sheltered in the storm. Jump down to 7:17. For 40 days, the flood waters grew deeper, covering the ground and lifting the boat high above the earth. They were still in the storm. The storm had come, but they were safe from the storm. Far too often we pray for shelter from the storm when God promises to shelter us in the storm. Noah chose to find shelter in God. I was thinking about some of those songs that we sang this morning. They were picked on purpose because of what we were talking about today. But the ark didn't have a rudder. It didn't have sails to catch the wind. It didn't have an engine. All it did is it floated really, really well. It bobbed up and down. There was no direction except for to trust God in the middle of the storm, that God promised to keep them safe, to keep the animals safe, and all he could do was trust. I'm sure it was a wild ride as the floodwaters came and they rose up and they were tossed back and forth in the waves. And yet Noah knew that he was safe in the hands of God. How many of you have testimonies of God seeing you through the storm, of God being there through your hardest and darkest hours, but God was there nonetheless, and he brought you through it? There's a lesson here. Peace comes when we spend less time complaining about the storm and instead choose to let God be our shelter in the middle of the storm, knowing that his promise is to bring us safely through it. There's a reason why Paul and James said to count it joy when we face trials and tribulations. Not to pray that God will avoid trials and tribulations, but to count it joy. Because in the middle of the trial and tribulation, in the middle of the storm that you're going through, God is right there, step by step, carrying you through the storm. Just like Noah in the ark, we might feel the bobs and the waves, we might get crashed around, we might fall over. I guarantee you it took a little while for Noah to get his sea legs on those 40 days. And those first few days are probably the worst as the rain came, and up went the boat, and it was tossed back and forth. And all the stuff that he was going on, and people around him dying. All his friends, everything else being wiped away from the face of the earth. But he was safe in the promise of God. You know, God doesn't say that he's going to keep us from having hard times. He says quite the opposite, that in this world we're going to have troubles. But he promised us to keep us safe in the storm. David wrote in Psalm 23, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." He fears no evil because God is there with him, for you are with me. And so when we walk through the valley, when we're there in the midst of the hard times, we're in the middle of the storm, we know that we don't have to fear the shadow of death because God is the one that keeps us safe. And it's through the storm, step by step, that he is there and keeping us there. He keeps us sheltered in the storm. Psalm 91 verse 4 says, "He will shelter you in his wings. His faithful promises are your armor and your protection." This verse isn't about avoiding the storm, but it's about being sheltered in the middle of the storm. God is telling Noah there is going to be a storm. There's going to be such a storm that's going to kill every other person on the face of the planet. But in the middle of the rain, in the middle of the wind, in the middle of being tossed to and fro, in the middle of getting seasick, in the middle of everything else going completely out of control, I will be your shelter. I will keep you safe. I will protect you. That was God's promise, and Noah's choice was to trust and obey. So here's the thing, church. God is asking us to obey everything the Holy Spirit speaks to us. We know that He knows best, yet we struggle sometimes to fully obey. It's about putting the human nature to death and allowing the Spirit to truly live in us. Part of the reason that Noah was known as a righteous man was because he was an obedient man. When God gave Noah specific instructions to build the ark, Noah followed those commands. God gave Noah the exact measurements of the ark, told him exactly how to build the ark, and even gave him the exact number of animals to let on the ark. 7 pairs of clean animals and birds, and 1 pair of each unclean animal. Noah didn't question God's instruction. He built the ark, and he was told, even when everyone around him thought he was crazy, he continued to trust. His obedience brought protection not only to his life, but to his wife, to his sons, and to their wives. Sometimes in our lives, obedience to God is not the easiest. Sometimes people call us crazy and say that there's no way God is telling you that. Sometimes reading our Bible, going to church, staying away from the sins of the flesh and getting rid of the wrong crowd is a hard choice. But that choice may result in others making fun of us and discounting us. Even as adults, we still get made fun of for making the choices to follow God. And yet we have to follow God and keep right on what he has because God is righteous and he will honor your obedience. He will be the one to give you the applause, not the crowd around you. There will be times when God will give you specific instructions to complete. Perhaps at that exact moment, we're not going to understand it. But know that God sees the bigger picture. He knows what's around the corner. He knows what's over this next hill. And we have to be obedient to what he is telling us to do. He's the one who has written our story, who has a complete book of Gary. He has a complete book of Eric. And he knows exactly what's there. And he knows the next chapter and what it's going to leave. I love reading books. And one of the things that drives me crazy sometimes is when the author ends the book on a cliffhanger. And you have to then read the next chapter, or ends the chapter on a cliffhanger, and you want to keep turning the pages. He knows what cliffhanger you're on right now. He knows what storm you're in the middle of right now. He already knows the outcome. He has the plan. You have to trust him and be obedient to what he is calling you to do and to keep being faithful. Keep following, keep trusting, step by step, day by day. Don't give up on what God has for you. Trust in the bigger picture. Pursue righteousness and obedience like Noah did. Here's the promise. Jeremiah 20:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. They are plans for good and not for evil, plans to give you a hope and a future." He knows the plans. He has the whole blueprint written out. Psalm 16:11 says, "For I've made known to you the path of life. There, at my right hand, there are pleasures forevermore. At my right hand, there's fullness of joy. In my presence, there are pleasures forevermore." Sorry, I quoted that wrong. He's given it to you. Trust him. Walk the path. It's not an easy path. It's a narrow path. It's a hard path, but it's worth it because his promises are true and they're going to be fulfilled. In the end, you're going to look back and look at all the heartache and look at all the things that you went through, look at all the storms you went through, and watch how God, step by step, brought you through. Step by step, kept his promises. Step by step, was there. God will work together all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. In church, you are called according to his purpose. And so while the first thing that God's asking us is to obey everything that the Holy Spirit says, the second thing is to fully trust that that he is our shelter in the middle of the storm. He's proven himself in the past. Why do we doubt him now? Why do we doubt him in the middle of the hard times? You know, the song "It Is Well," which will be what we close with later on today. I can still remember today having my guitar and playing that song in the hospital room as Josiah is being put on a feeding tube. Itty bitty 4-pounder, actually less than 4 pounds at that point, because he couldn't eat any food, or he didn't have enough energy to even eat his bottle, and they put a feeding tube down. And I remember crying with joy, but yet singing this song, "It is well, it is well, it is well." And sometimes you have to sing it until you believe it. Because it wasn't well. This wasn't okay that my itty-bitty baby was in the hospital struggling. It wasn't okay that he had to be in an incubator because he couldn't keep heat, and he went from being 4 pounds 3 ounces to under 4 pounds and losing. That wasn't okay. But I had to trust God despite it not being okay in the physical, and trust God to say, "It is well with my soul." In the middle of the storm, in the middle of what I'm going through, I'm going to trust that, God, you have it under control. And so we have to go through and trust him. You know, in Arizona, there's a monsoon season every summer. And the sky's lit up in a brilliant purple light. It's beautiful. And the reality is that when this happens, flash floods in the desert are incredibly dangerous. And you can only enjoy the storm if you're in a place of safety. Only if you're sheltered from the storm. And I was up in Eagle last summer, and there was a storm coming through across the mountains, across the Yukon River. And I was over at the Falcon Inn Bed and Breakfast, great little place, and she's got a second-story balcony that I was on there. And everybody else had left. I was and I was out there just enjoying the storm. And it's across it, and I'm watching the great lightning happening over there on the mountains. It was really fun to watch. And all of a sudden, I noticed the storm move in my direction. So I thought I should go inside. I turned to go inside, and bam! The door slams, locking me out on the porch. Fortunately, I had my cell phone on me. And fortunately, the call went through because AT&T was having trouble, and so I was happened to be able to call with my Verizon phone to a landline and call the owner of the bed and breakfast, and she came and let me off the porch, but not before I was getting pummeled by the storm. I enjoyed the storm until I didn't have shelter anymore. You don't have to be a prophet to know that in a room this size, there are people. There's somebody here going through a storm. You're facing a monsoon, and maybe you've turned around and there's the wind and there's the rain, and you're stuck out on the porch and you don't know how to get back in. Maybe there's flash floods coming and you feel like you're in the flood. You're tired, you're confused, you just need relief, a break in the storm. Psalm 40, starting in verse 1, says, I waited patiently for the Lord to help me. And he turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the pit of despair, out of the mud and the mire. He set my feet on solid ground and steadied me as I walked along. He gave me a new song to sing, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see what he has done and be amazed, and they will put their trust in the Lord. Some versions say he lifted his feet out of the water and placed me on dry ground. Did you know that what Noah had to do all those days in that big, smelly boat? You know what his job was? Take care of the animals. But what were they really doing besides that? They were waiting. They were trusting. They were obeying. If you feel like you're in the middle of a storm, maybe you're struggling to trust and obey. Maybe you just want to feel the reassurance in the Holy Spirit. He is right here to say, you know what, you're not alone. I'm going to shelter you. If you're at that point where you feel like you're about to drown, you feel like the floodwaters are coming up and there's just nothing you can do, you got to turn to God and say, God, help. And his promise is that he's going to lift you up. He's going to place you on dry ground. You know, the thing with the miry clay, the mire, the dirt, is that by itself, that's that mud that you can't get out of by yourself, and you're just stuck. You need someone to come alongside you. You need God to pick you up and say, it's all right, my child. I've got you. I've always promised to protect you. Just got to trust. You've got to obey. You got to follow what I've got. You know, as we're going to go back and we're going to sing that song we sang earlier about it as well. But if you're in that storm right now and you're just going, I don't know what God's going to do. I don't know how I'm going to get through that. He's there. You have to trust him. I want to pray with you this morning. Here's the thing. Here's how the story ends. Genesis 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock with him in the boat. He sent a wind to blow across the earth, and the floodwaters began to recede. Church, friends, God has not forgotten you. In the middle of your storm, it may take a while for the floodwaters to recede. Noah was stuck for a little while. He still had to wait. But God's working in your life. Dry ground is coming. And one day Noah finds dry ground again. Because God's promises are faithful and true. Whatever you're going through, God's got it handled. We have to trust him today. So if you're going through something hard, I'd love to pray with you. If you just want to come to God and say, God, I haven't been trusting, I haven't been obeying the way I should, and you just want to get back right with God, the altar's here, it's available. But let's put our trust in God, that it is well. You know, the wind and waves, they still know his name. They still respond. He still is under